This week on Cross Section, we look at the Labour Party conference, the speeches that have been made, and the fact that Labour plan to renew Britain. What does that even look like, and how, as Christians, can we respond? We also talk about this plan for digital ID cards and the reasons why it's created such a mixed response. This is an episode you do not want to miss.
Hello and welcome to Cross Section, another week where we have conversations at the intersection of faith, news and culture. I'm going to be your host today, and I'm joined by Danny Webster, who's in the studio with me.
Hello.
And we have our Northern Ireland correspondent all the way in Coleraine, Peter Lynas. How are you, Peter?
I'm good. I'm in Port Stewart. It's close to Coleraine, but it's different.
Nah, same thing for me when I'm there. But glad that you're with us on the episode. Beautiful. So we're going to open with kind of a news roundup, stories or culture stories that have really resonated with us this week. And I'm going to start with the US comedian Bill Maher, who made this interesting comment on his show around the conflict in Nigeria. And I thought it was quite pertinent to our times, given that all that's going on. He says, "I'm not a Christian, but they are systematically killing the Christians in Nigeria. They're killing over 100,000 since 2009. These are the Islamists, Boko Haram," he said. "This is so much more of a genocide attempt than what is going on in Gaza. They are literally attempting to wipe out the Christian population of an entire country." And this is the point that I thought stood out. He says, "Where are the kids protesting this?" he asked, criticizing the lack of mainstream media coverage and noting the absence of a public outcry in the USA. And I just think that I think it's fascinating continuing to have these conversations where people are engaging in Christianity, but equally engaging in different news stories. He's open, he has no faith. And he says, where is the uproar? If we're a society of justice, we're engaged on international stage, where is the outcry for the massacres that are taking place in Nigeria? And I think that's a continued encouragement and challenge to media and outlets about where they're speaking about moments of injustice, and particularly against Christian minorities in Nigeria. So that's my news story that caught my eye. That is engaged in that way. Danny, what about you? What's got your eye?
Oh, well, I was on my way to bed last night and I saw all the news alerts and push notifications that apparently we could have eternal peace in Israel and Gaza, or at least that's the language that Donald Trump has used. He says that his 20-point plan for peace that he announced with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could lead to eternal peace. Now, this is only a proposal. It has been presented to Hamas, and they are expected to respond in the next few days. It could be a really significant step towards peace. The release of hostages, a demilitarized Hamas out of Gaza. Yes, there are some things that some of the hardline elements in the Israeli cabinet don't like. People criticize Benjamin Netanyahu, but he is not the most hardline in his cabinet. People have been criticizing him for example, members of Hamas that lay down their weapons will have amnesty. So there will be criticism of it, but if Hamas do agree to it, it looks like this could be very significant. The idea that you will have a peace board chaired by Donald Trump and with Sir Tony Blair as the most notable other key figure is slightly eye-watering and fascinating, and one of those weird turns of global politics that I don't quite know what's going to come next.
Do they have to apply for that job, or is it self-appointed, Donald Trump and former Prime Minister?
Well, I'm pretty sure Donald Trump installed himself, and Tony Blair's probably been angling for something like this for a while.
Okay, so the news in Israel-Gaza and a potential peace deal. And Peter, what is your one story that you would like to share with us today?
It's about 16 very important stories. The standout is the Ryder Cup victory. Europe never in doubt is what I'd like to say. But what intrigued me was the more abusive world that we live in. This, again, contentious nature, even something like golf. I love a bit of competition, but the shouts from the crowd, the kind of abusive nature of it was really troubling. Scotty Scheffler, really interesting, staying to the side of one of the more contentious issues. His caddy less so, although he apologised. He's a Christian and does a little sermonette on social media from time to time. So I did notice that. And it does link with me, the abusive world, to J.K. Rowling and Emma Watson's feud extraordinaire. It's just so intrigued that Emma Watson's trying to walk it back just a little bit because the vibe has changed. because there's a thing called the vibe shift going on. Just to provoke Danny. But Emma has worked out the tide is turning, and J.K. Rowling's just not having any of it. And it is one of the things we've talked about a little bit in this show, is around the space for forgiveness, for saying sorry, and how do you move forward. Actually, we are in a cancel culture both ways. J.K. Rowling feels that Emma tried to cancel her and did. Emma may or may not be trying to walk it back because the culture has changed, and J.K. is having none of it right now. It's a pretty, again, outspoken way of engaging, and I think it is a challenge to us as to how we engage well in the public square.
Amazing. And so, somewhat transitioning from our news roundup, both cultural, sport and global affairs, there is a magazine that's coming out tomorrow that I've been waiting for the best part of 4 weeks for. GQ magazine are releasing in the front of their cover What's So Great About Britain, where they bring together British artists from across the UK, articulating through their craft, their medium, what's so great about Britain. And I think it's just an interesting conversation in the sense we've been looking at in previous weeks about nationhood, about identity, about politics, and it's even being a theme and a thread within a magazine. Danny, you had some reflections on whether they land that question well or not.
Well, they certainly don't land it. I heard the article's online. I've scanned through it. I have not read every single one of the 9,000 plus words. There's 14 different contributors. It kind of comes back to this thing that has been talked about time and time again. Whenever British values come up, the more you try and nail it down, the harder it actually becomes. You end up talking about queuing and kind of sarcasm and a British mannerism and an approach to things and resilience. And there's all sorts of kind of slightly amorphous ideas that tie together. And people are like, well, yeah, that is what it means to be British. But try and put it on a pledge card of these are the British values, which is sometimes what governments have thought about and tried to do. And it doesn't land. So like maybe a long form, multi-author interview is a good way of exploring just the complexities of what it is to be British.
Peter, just throwing a question to you. How would you answer that question about what does it mean to be British for you?
Well, I'd probably go with Northern Irish first as part of that British and Irish kind of bringing those things together. But I've said it before, I've got a British passport and an Irish passport application on my desk. I think proud is such a kind of funny word. So I find am I proud to be British? But I really appreciate being part of Great Britain. I do think there's lots of positives to that in terms of some of the values and some of the services that we get and some of what it means to be in both and globally, how we engage in the world and locally. But I absolutely agree. The British values question is a really weird one. I was looking at something this week and you go back to a prevent strategy from 2011 to get an articulation of them that seemed to be just somebody in passing doing it. We really struggle to say what are British values beyond queuing.
And so whilst it's hard for kind of artists to articulate or they're expressing themselves, we're going to talk about our first news story, which just follows on as we've all listened in on Labour Party conference and in particular the Prime Minister's address to conference and the nation at large. And the whole theme for the Labour Party conference was Renew Britain. Danny, what was some of your reflections on the conference and even that theme? Why Renew Britain?
Right. So in part, the conference has been overshadowed by internal party drama, questions around Andy Burnham. Is he vying for the leadership? Well, he quite explicitly was putting himself forward. He has been very unsubtle about his attempts to suggest that he would do a better job as Labour leader than Keir Starmer, although I feel like this week has passed and the challenges and the complexities of him doing it have mounted the appetite in the party to do that, even if they've got problems with Keir Starmer. I don't think this is his moment, and I think he's wasted a lot of capital, a lot of goodwill over the last couple of weeks. So I think that's just an interesting sideshow. I think on the Renew Britain point, I think the challenge that the Labour Party have and what was apparent in Keir Starmer's speech is they've been in power for just over a year. When you're in opposition, it's fine to talk about broken Britain, the problems of Britain, and that had been the narrative until the early days of the government. Look what the other party did and how wrong this party has left the problems they've left us with. Now they're trying to talk up Britain. So the best part of Keir Starmer's speech was in the final section when he was talking about hope. He was talking about the good bits about Britain, what we should hold on to and what we should have hope in, and why it's not broken. And yet he then says we want to renew Britain. Renew suggests a sense of change. So he's in this awkward position. The Labour government are in this awkward position where they've been in power long enough now to have to take ownership of what they're doing, but they also want to say that there's stuff that they want to be changing. And that's a difficult narrative and a difficult one for them to tread. And so much of this conference has been in opposition to Nigel Farage. All of the headlines will be about like Nigel Farage and his grievance culture. Nigel Farage doesn't like Britain, accusations that he's racist. Now, Nigel Farage immediately took to all his social media channels as soon as Keir Starmer sat down to broadcast his own response, to criticise him. I'm not sure that's a great step. I know that Labour see reform as an existential challenge to them, and politically that's a big one. But if all the headlines about Keir Starmer are actually headlines about Nigel Farage, he's lost the debate.
Peter, do you think Renew Britain is the right theme for the current moment and for this party conference?
I mean, I don't think it's a bad theme. It's a strange one. He's kind of keep saying Britain isn't broken, but then it does need renewed. So it's something maybe in between broken, but because it still needs renewed. It's not like it's heading the right direction and we're trying to keep driving forward. I think, most people are going to say, of course it's broken. There's serious problems with the NHS. There's serious problems in terms of housing, and there's serious problems in terms of this kind of marches and the deep fraction that is going on. We are, if the polling is correct, seeing a seismic shift in where politics is going. So where I definitely agree with Danny is I think Farage has framed the speech. For good or for bad, you could say Sir Keir, the Prime Minister, has taken it to Nigel Farage, or you could say Nigel Farage has set the territory and he's now playing on Farage's turf. I have to say I probably think it's the second, and Farage is better in that territory. That's not a statement of support either way. The reality is I do think Nigel Farage will do better in that terrain, and he is essentially getting to define Keir Starmer's speech. So I think that's a problem and a challenge that they have, and Sir Keir Starmer's not a particularly captivating speaker in terms of his presentational style, so it's not like the clips are going to kind of go viral of him. That's just a challenge he has, and in the age that we live in. So not a bad theme, but we're coming to other speeches and maybe others have done better, but I do think the territory has been defined by Farage, and that works for him.
And even one of the most, not complicated, but nuanced sections of policy in the speech, where the Prime Minister was seeking to differentiate between a compassionate asylum system that allowed and created space for people who are fleeing war and persecution, how he wants to have that, and have a stricter and tougher immigration system to deter false claimants and to deal with people that don't gain either immigration or asylum status in the UK. That was a reasonably well done piece of policy articulation. It'll get completely lost in all the media coverage of it. So it's almost like, why do the hard work to set out a careful case when people aren't going to pay attention to that? Like, the government can't decide whether they need to talk more about immigration because Nigel Farage and Reform are talking about it so much, or are they just having to kind of ape Reform in sounding tough? And you had that this week, that both Keir Starmer and Shabana Mahmood were trying to talk up the toughness of what they're doing on immigration policy so as to say, we're taking this problem seriously. But on the kind of political narrative point, on the popular discourse, Nigel Farage will always trump them with the sound bites, and what he's going to pledge to do. Whether that's realistic and legitimate is a different question. So I think they're getting into a war of words that they're not going to win.
I think something that I observed from all kind of cabinet ministers, whether that's Shabina Mahmood, who's the Home Secretary, David Lammy, who's the Deputy Prime Minister, Bridget Phillipson, who's the Education Secretary, it felt like all of them were briefed to include the word patriot. It didn't matter what their policy area was, to articulate that they are patriots, they are true patriots, and every other version that Nigel Farage presents is false patriotism. Actually, it's borderline, and some of the kind of speakers did say racist in terms of what he's trying to articulate. And I think for me, that was, again, coming back to Peter's point, that they're responding and reacting to reform. One of the deputy kind of leader candidates, Lucy Powers, saying we don't fight reform on reform's territory. We need to come with a counter narrative. And actually, she was arguing, and she's still in the kind of the candidacy, we should be questioning whether they are the terms of reference that we should be engaging with, the terms of the debate on this. And so I was saying it's going to be interesting to see next week whether the Conservative Party break with all the other parties in not having flags in the main arena, because they will be the standout. Liberal Democrats, Reform, Labour, all of them at the kind of keynote speech had flags kind of there at the time. So if the situation in the UK is one of renewal, and the Labour Party or politicians are trying to craft a narrative of national identity that either needs to return to either its Christian heritage or an alternative vision of industrialization and the economy, what's the Christian? How do we as Christians articulate a different vision in this kind of cultural, political, chaotic landscape? Let's come to you, Peter, first with that.
Well, it might seem a strange beginning to my answer, but I think I found Shabana Mahmood's speech very interesting, and she talks about her faith. Now, it's a Muslim faith for her, and she talks about her upbringing and experience, and I thought her way of bringing that into the conversation was actually really helpful and healthy. She named the march, she named the numbers. She wasn't afraid to say 150,000, for example. People may say more, but others have often diminished it. She said what she saw going on, some elements, again, very similar to our letter, actually, in many ways. In what she said, she acknowledged what was happening. So I suppose part of the chat, why I said that initially was that as somebody, I have been intrigued by how she has navigated quite often bringing her faith into the conversation and quite explicitly saying, for example, in assisted suicide, why that drove and motivated her in ways that Christians have often been reluctant to. And again, so I'm challenged a little bit by her expression and her clarity as to how she does that, because I think that's what I want to do in the analysis of some of these speeches is to do the same. How do we apply our faith and say, okay, here's the bits I agree with, here's the bits I don't, and here's bits that are purely political. Some of the issues around planning in particular, let's take a really obvious one, are pure political. Some people are going to be more or less in favour of some of the things that are going to be said around that. Immigration, even to some extent, will have some aspects where say, well, here's bits that would, I think, cross the threshold, go beyond what it is to be Christian. Here's bits that clearly are, but somewhere in the middle, there's going to be Christians who take differing views on that. So acknowledging that as well, I think is going to be really important. I mean, it's one of the things, final thing I maybe say about Sir Keir Starmer's speech. There is no faith articulation there. There is no, there's not something deeper that resonates, a thread to pull on. And again, as I read the Home Secretary speech, she has a deeper thread to pull on, even though I fundamentally disagree with her Muslim faith or Islamic faith. She can pull that into a conversation in a way that I find many other politicians, it's not just Sir Keir, lie very flat and talk about a claim to British values, which again are unarticulated. And there's a shallowness to some of what's being said at this moment. So I actually think it's really interesting and great for us to respond as Christians and say, we're pulling on a much deeper story. We're pulling on something much more substantive in this moment, whether we agree or disagree with all that's being said. So that's my first thoughts. As somebody who then read Keir's 2024 speech in my preparation for this and then realised halfway through I was reading the wrong year, it sounded a bit weird.
I think it's interesting that Shabana Mahmood and Wes Streeting were two of the standout speeches. Wes Streeting gave a speech on Tuesday morning as the Health Secretary. They are also the two people within the cabinet who are seen as high prospects for future leader of the Labour Party. There's no vacancy. There may not be a vacancy for a while. My expectation is there won't be one for a couple of years. But some of the chat's not going to stop. So them performing well will only increase some of that chat within the political party. But I think it does come down to this, well, what's the overarching vision? And I think that's... So Keir Starmer struggles with his communication because he comes across as quite managerial, quite... Peter said, quite flat. There's just not much energy there. Even if you agree with what he's saying, actually, where's the passion, where's the drive, where's the vision behind what he's saying? I think one of the challenges and the tasks for us as Christians is to paint a picture of actually, well, what does the good life look like? What is for the public good of all? What is it that we believe that makes society good for people, for everyone in our nation, and how does our faith influence what we believe about that? And some of it will be really, really specifically tied to our faith. Other bits, I think the planning system we can say a lot from a Christian perspective about a good planning system, but we won't go there right now. So I think what we have to say about so many different areas of policy can come back to what we believe and what we think is true, but it's what we think is good and works and beneficial for all of society. So I think telling that holistic story of what we want for society, of the kind of society we want and we think will help people to prosper. Well, we're not the politicians, we're not the people running the country, but I think that's what I want to see from politicians, a big picture, a big vision that then helps make sense of the particular policy decisions that they're taking.
I think that's where we are at as a nation, not just in politics, that lack of vision of whether it's humanism, whether it's individualism, where it's this like sense of self, all of these other stories and visions or philosophies are breaking down. And it's a role of the church to articulate what is the vision? What does the kingdom of heaven actually look like? How does that materialize? We're not talking about planning laws, but I do sometimes see Revelation and that, that great royal kind of clear ground and think, oh, what would that look like if you could articulate that in policy? But conference has come, or at least the Labour Party conference has come and it's gone. Most people, many of our listeners, possibly many within the church, have not listened to the speech. How does this make a difference? How should the church engage beyond party conference season? Coming to you, Peter.
Well, so, okay, at the core of the speech is something about patriotism. And I actually think it's easy for us to say, and I'll say, I don't think the Prime Minister did a great job on that. He didn't know what to say. But I'm not sure we know what to say about that. So obviously some nervousness from some around nationalism. But what does it look like to be patriotic about country? Should we be? How do we articulate that well? So I think that's one to think about. He struggled with the United Kingdom bit. He talked about the St. George's Cross and then the Saltire, I think, at one point. But, fundamentally, I think was wrestling with anything beyond England. So I'd have a question about that for each of us, Northern Irish, Scottish, Welsh, English. How do we articulate that well? What does a healthy version of that look like? How do we acknowledge that each of those flags has a patron saint on it that draws from our different history of George, Andrew and Patrick, and poor Wales getting left out and maybe represented in the dragon? Don't write in about that, please. But, how do we articulate as a Christian, each of us, our pride or our acknowledgement, our excitement about the nation that we live in? Obviously we've talked about Christian nationalism in the last couple of weeks, so we're aware of some of the stuff around that, but I think there's a lot more work to be done there. That's just one thing that I would take from that speech is, what does it mean to be British for us as Christians? What's good citizenship, as Danny was saying? How do we speak humbly about some of the things that have happened in the past that we've been involved in? How do we speak clearly around issues of violence and any incitement to violence? And how do we be brave on a range of issues? Some of us are more passionate, maybe find it easier to speak against some of the progressive and secular agenda. What about the more nationalist authoritarian agenda? And I'm not saying those are mutually exclusive. There are lots of moves going on, even just consumerism in our churches. How do we call out any of these things and articulate something different? So easy to say to politicians, your stuff wasn't great. And we're going to keep saying that, but then we will need to do better. I also think, last thing on that is, again, the void piece. They're not great because what else can they say? There's only so far it can go. Politics deals with some of the fundamentals. We've done a lot of that. Now it's dealing with extra fringe issues. It feels like sometimes we're like, this is stuff the church should absolutely be right in the heart of. Talking about community, talking about integrity, talking about identity and who we are. That's a great conversation to build from kingdom identity to the importance or otherwise of national borders and what that means, how we hold that in its rightful place within our articulation and understanding of who we are, and acknowledging that and engaging in areas where some of the underlying problems that sit beneath that, marginalisation, deprivation of certain groups. We do huge amounts of youth work, brilliant, and we talk about identity. And in part of that, we're going to need to deal with some of these new issues coming. So I think we need to do lots of that and be aware of our own blind spots on some of this stuff. We're going to naturally incline different ways politically. Let's make sure we have good lenses on and biblical lenses as we come to some of these conversations.
So Peter set us all a challenge. What does it mean to be a Christian and patriotic? What does it mean to be a Christian, part of the United Kingdom, and articulating that? So as listeners, why not let us know? Why not email in at cross.section@eauk.org? If you're liking the episode, why not share with a family friend and pass that on? And I think Danny had something to share in terms about mugs that I'll let you pitch in.
Oh, well, we've been having a lively debate as to whether we should be getting cross-section mugs. I am all for cross-section mugs. I'm yet to convince all of my co-cross-section squad.
He's yet to convince Alicia, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think me and Zana might just go ahead and order them. So we may have cross-section mugs. We may even, there's like minimum order on these sorts of things. So we might have a few. And if you write in with particularly great comments and questions, you might win a mug.
There we go.
Somebody like to sponsor our mugs, we'll take it.
Freebies. Well, there you go. Future episode to receive a cross-section mug. So moving into our final story and update, it's around the Global Progress Summit. Before party conference, the Prime Minister took to the stage to say that he and his government are going to introduce a free of charge but mandatory digital ID for those to demonstrate a right to work. Coming to you, Danny, on the poll front, put out a poll on X and Peter put out a poll on Instagram. So that's me priming you both. What are some of your followers saying? What's the reaction to that? Support or oppose?
So over the last 24 hours, 66% are opposed, 17% support, 11% say it depends, and 6% don't know. So that's my little snapshot.
And Peter, what's yours?
Very similar. I was even simpler for the Instagram crowd. 64% no, 11% yes, and 25% not sure.
So for the 25% or the 4%, depending on which poll you use, who are unsure, Danny, what was being proposed by the Prime Minister?
Well, the government are proposing a digital, so it wouldn't be a physical card, a digital ID that would be mandatory if you want to work. So if you're a student, if you're a pensioner, if you're not in work and not looking for work, you don't need to have one. So it's not 100% compulsory, but for people who are looking to work, you would have to have it to prove your right to work. Now, it is being offered as primarily a way of tackling illegal working, tackling illegal immigration, some of the draw that might be to people coming if they think they can work without having the right to work. Employers already have to have a duty to ensure that people have the right to work, but whether this will make it easier for them to do that well, perhaps. But it has been interesting, just the speed at which there's been backlash against this. It was no surprise that there was a backlash against this, but just the speed, 2.5 million people already signing petition against it.
To stand in opposition. Peter, why do you think 2.5 million people have expressed their strong no to this idea?
I think it's the digital tracking piece. There's a bit of COVID carryover there. There's just general hesitancy around the kind of data that is held on us. And I mean, I don't mind saying at this moment in time, I'm really kind of unsure, somewhat sidetracked by some Christian nationalism conversations and pieces of writing. So this came and I was like, I don't think I have the headspace to really wrestle. We knew it was coming in some way, shape or form. And I have... one part of me is like, there's a whole load of data that's held on me. I have a biometric passport. I don't really even know what that it holds about me. I am about to get, again, I've said, an Irish passport. So they hold a certain amount of data on me. The government holds all sorts of pieces of information on me already, as my health records are there. Lots of pieces of information are held about me in various places. And I'm reasonably reluctant about taking those forms. But I am also a pragmatist. So I probably tick things I shouldn't just to get things done. So... and yet at the same time, I have this nervousness about a digital card, which is ultimately going to start to control a lot of access to a lot of places. So I think that's what a lot of people have that hesitancy about. They're beginning to say, hold on, do we really need this? And yet we hold a lot of paper versions of it. But that's the counter. We hold the paper. Why do we need the other? It's interesting. Some of the same groups, I think, like, you know, more to the right, who have some... who want to limit immigration, and this would be part of the purpose of the card, are also those most opposed to having it. And it feels like the level of disagreement already. I can't see how this actually lands, because so many people have what they would consider a profound disagreement to it. Last thing I'll say is I still think a lot of this is cultural. So you go to people in the States and you talk about the NHS, and some people just think it's the maddest concept. But because we've grown up with it, we think it's brilliant. But Americans on the right just think it's nuts. They just can't comprehend it. I think so much of it is culturally shaped where we are. There are lots of places that have ID cards of all sorts. It's a perfectly standard, normal thing to do. You need photographic ID. We always had it as a driver's license here in Northern Ireland. You were much more likely to carry it back in the Troubles. So one part of me is like, it's not that unusual to carry. I travel a lot. I always have a driver's license with me. But then, so I just think there's so much cultural shaping, and this current bit is a final cultural shaping of this moment, is this reactiveness to anything. Right, the government aren't getting their hands on anything about me. I'm going, they already hold a whole load of stuff, probably. So I'm not sure that a lot of this is theologically thought through, shall we say. I'm intrigued to read something a bit more substantive, but again, this to me is a second order issue. I don't think there's an obvious Christian yes or no. So that'll get a few people emailing, I'm sure.
Well, I don't think there is a specifically Christian argument. I am skeptical about this, both on civil liberties grounds, but also about effectiveness. I don't think it's going to do what the government say it will do. I don't think it will produce this massive disincentive to people coming over. I think if people want to dodge the current system and employ people illegally, they're going to continue to dodge the system and employ people illegally. I think the centralization of data to aggregate it all together is concerning. I think we've seen significant cybersecurity attacks and the frailty of some of those systems. So I think there are legitimate concerns there. So I don't think it's a simple issue where we say, actually, as Christians, we are opposed to it. Like, as a Christian, I would say I am skeptical about it. I can see some of the arguments why people would support it. I don't think they are sufficient to justify it. I think the challenge is that when you start teasing it apart, actually there would be arguments for justice, that actually if we want a more just immigration system that operates fairly and people are treated equally and people don't have their identity stolen and other things happen, actually having a more robust system of securing that could lead to just outcomes. But then actually, whether it's about freedom or individual liberty, there are other arguments that would argue against it. So I think Christians will come at this from different perspectives and bring different arguments that are informed by their faith and what they believe to argue in favour or against it.
Yeah, I think some of the nervousness around the digital ID brick cards is in part around cyber attacks or the threat or the potential that the government won't be able to develop the IT system. But I think it's also set in a context where an unpopular prime minister in a fragile government is proposing an efficiency measure on a policy issue. And I think it's being heard as another layer of control by the government. And I think that's where the strong resistance of the 2+ million people is like, no, I'm not giving you any more permission to kind of consolidate all my information in one place. As a final question, coming to you, Peter, then Danny, how does the church engage with this? The idea of more digitalization of information, the more sharing of our data with the government. You mentioned there's not exactly a theology on this. Where would be a starting point of thinking for those listening?
That is a great question. I think I probably put it in the chat and then went, well, I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, it is interesting how much information my own church has about me and how much we use apps, Planning Center, and it has lots of information about myself and my kids and things, again, to make life function easier for us and to have that kind of information. I guess, I mean, part of it is we do need to ask those questions, like, why do people disagree with it? How much of that is, again, shaped by a current online presence that gets you thinking in particular ways? I mean, how much of this is actually shaped by Christian thinking? How much of this is shaped by thinking about those on the margins? Is this actually helpful for some people? Does it create an easier ID and verification system? And we were just talking before the show with somebody else about you have to get so often you're asked for something with an address from within the last 3 months. It's now impossible these days to get a physical piece of paper saying that. Mm-hmm. I'm somebody who hasn't moved house in 15 years. What's that like for somebody in a much more transient lifestyle? How do you prove anything? So I'd be interested to see if it's potentially useful to many other people. It doesn't cause me the same level of concern. So again, it's probably thinking about it on behalf of the others. One of the things we need to do in the church, who does this help and who does this potentially hinder? In what ways and on what basis then might we support it? Because I think personally for me is not going to make a huge difference either way. So I should be and want to be thinking on behalf of other people in that moment. It's one thing the church can do. I mean, it sits in a wider suite of how we do hand across information, how we engage online. And there are bits of that, again, that we've said, look, we think can be healthy and engaging. And there are bits of that we always said, look, this is shaping so much of who we are in this moment. So I guess that's one of the step backs we can do. And again, it's a great conversation with the church. Why do we think this way, and how might it shape our thinking, especially on a second order issue where I think we can agree to disagree. And that's going to be an important thing, I think, to challenge. Say, actually, this is an agree to disagree level issue. This is not first order. There's absolutely no text you can point to say this is out and out bad or out and out good. We've got to respect there'll be some different views on that and agree to differ amicably and well.
And I think there was an interesting piece in the Times earlier this week that made I thought it was quite astute comment that is this mandatory smartphone usage. Questions have already been raised about how will this work for people who might not have smartphones. It might be free, but are people going to have then the devices in order to use it? There are also government questions as to who's funding it and who's responsible for it. Apparently it's living in the Department of Science and Technology, not the Home Office. Liz Kendall is the Secretary of State responsible for that. But I think it's how do these things change us as well? And I think that's one of the interesting things with some of these, whether it's technology or attitudes or what's required. We live in a we do have to comply with all sorts of things, whether it's to rent a house, to when I'm applying for my children's schools, I had to prove where I lived. Meant going onto a council website, downloading a copy of a council tax statement that I didn't actually ever have a physical copy of. But we do live in a world where compliance is quite an important theme. But actually, how has that changed how we interact with other people? We don't trust what people say. You have to prove your ID in various different contexts. Again, legitimate reasons for some of that. How does it change some of our relationships with each other, but also with the state and with our communities? So I think thinking through some of these things, some of these wider issues, well, as Peter says, recognizing that we are going to disagree on where we land on the specifics of this particular issue.
Yes.
Can I just jump in and say, I hope none of the 2.6 million people are going to go to America as well and get an ESTA or a visa at the minute, because you have to give your social media profiles, you have to give your fingerprints, you have to give an image, you have to virtually confirm that image. You have to give way more information to go on holiday to Disneyland. So I hope they're consistent, because sometimes, again, when push comes to shove, people go, I'm signing that petition, but I'm going to give twice as much information to the American government just so I can go on holiday. So again, that'd be another place the church could lean in and ask for a bit more integrity. Sorry.
A deep, strong pushback. And for anyone who is watching this episode thinking, artificial intelligence, technology, where do I start? There's a perspective webinar coming up on Saturday, the 11th of October, that you can sign up to, and we should put in the show notes. But thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Danny, for engaging and having the conversation. What does it mean to be British? To be confirmed. Patriotism and technology. And thank you for joining this episode. Take care and God bless.